I am a social historian as opposed to an ag historian. But over the years, I've learned a lot of the social history that went along that supported the development of agriculture here. And it wasn't a straightforward process. In the United States, they said, free land out west, go get it. Here, it was a much different story. It was much more complicated. But I think in the long run, it helped develop this land in a more organized way, shall I say. And so it started way back when there was a crop being planted and harvested here. Does anybody know what the very first crop that was planted and harvested in this area? Stinkweed. No, it was a usable crop. Pardon? Not hemp. Not flax. No, it was tobacco. It was tobacco. The people who lived here long before there were any Europeans, the Nitsitapas or the Blackfoot, would plant tobacco in the spring. They would do it with a very elaborate ceremony, and then they would leave it for the whole summer. And they would come back to it in the fall and harvest whatever crop there was. So they left it to the sun and the rain and their prayers, and that was the very first crop that was grown here. Of course, the Blackfoot also harvested all of the different plants that were usable and the bison and the other wild animals. The other thing that needed to happen, the very first thing that needed to happen in this area was to kind of rescue it from the Americans. The Americans who had moved in to trade whiskey for buffalo hides. And so, Old Tomorrow, does anybody know who Old Tomorrow was? That was the nickname for Sir John A. Macdonald. He was the greatest procrastinator. He had legislation in his desk to establish a police force to come out west. But it wasn't until Americans came onto Canadian soil and committed murder that he was forced then to put that legislation into place and develop the Northwest Mounted Police. So the police trekked across the country and arrived here in 1874. And they were the people who were responsible for getting rid of the risky traders, but also to sign treaties with the First Nations in this area and to establish a sense of law and order and to be a Canadian presence, an official Canadian presence that the Americans had to respect because the Americans sure wanted this land. So that once the Mounties were here, treaties were signed, they were able to bring in other folks. And surveyors started to come into this area, but the surveyors had actually come ahead of the Mounties. The surveying for the border, the 49th parallel between Canada and the United States, happened in 1873, and the Mounties actually followed their trail across Canada. It was after that that they started to put in place in this area the 36-section township setup that we live with today, even after we've gone to the imperial or the metric system. So the very next industry that was related to agriculture started very shortly after the Mounties arrived. What would you suggest that first agricultural industry, large-scale industry, was? Cattle. That's right. The bison herds were decimated. They were almost non-existent by the 1880s. And that left all of this land with lush, very nutritious natural grasses lying fallow. So a lot of people looked at it and thought, let's bring in some cattle. The government helped that in a lot of ways. The government offered large corporations the chance to lease 100,000-acre plots for pennies an acre. So that made ranching very, very economical here. but it's not the small family ranches that we know of today. These were large corporations. Investors from the East and from England and from Europe sent managers out here. They hired would-be cowboys, a lot of them from England. No idea how to ride a horse with a Western saddle or to move cattle or to build their own homes. They all came from stone houses that were hundreds of years old. They had no idea how to cut a tree down and start making log buildings. So they went through a real serious learning curve. But these large corporate ranches would bring in thousands of cattle, almost exclusively from the United States, some as from as far away as Texas. So the Texas Longhorns, coming out of the desert and the heat, were often trailed all the way up into this area. Now they're a pretty hardy animal. They're very good at protecting themselves and their young with those longhorns, but they really struggled through the winters. And some of the winters here were pretty vicious. There were a couple of winters where there were tens of thousands of animals died simply because of the poor weather and one other factor. So around here we spend a lot of time putting up hay for the winter. Because there was this myth that there were always Chinooks that would keep the grass clear in this area, nobody was putting up hay. Nobody was cutting that grass to feed their animals in the winter. So when the heavy blizzards came and the cattle drifted because there were no fences, there was no feed for them, and they literally died by the tens of thousands in a couple of different winters. So that really put a lot of pressure on these large corporations because they had investors that wanted dividends. Of course, they weren't getting them unless the owners could manage to do a bit of a Ponzi scheme. Get more investors, and instead of putting that money into the ranch, they paid off their previous investors. So it was a tough way to make a living. The cattle were not put into feedlots and raised and sent to market as quickly as what we do today. What happened was that they were out on the range till they were 3 or sometimes 4-year-olds before they went to market. So that meant they build up in the summer, they'd drop their weight in the winter, they'd build up the summer, drop their weight in the winter. But it would take them that long to substantially gain enough weight to take them to market. So the markets initially in this area were pretty much one person, the government. The government had to feed its Northwest Mounted Police. It had to honor the treaties that promised the First Nations food for them to eat once the bison were gone. And of course the bison were pretty much gone by 1880. So the government was the main market. The train helped a bit by 1883 when it was in Calgary, but to raise cattle down here and range them all the way to Calgary, then ship them all the way east, meant a lot of loss of beef and a lot of cost. So it was, like I say, a tough time, and then the government made it tougher. Because in this area, this region, from all the prairie area, Saskatchewan and Alberta, there were a lot of people coming in from the eastern areas where there was no more land available, a lot of people leaving Europe, the UK, coming here looking for land. And this was the land that was available, but the ranchers had all these big leases. And there was a lot of pressure put on the government, and they finally rescinded those big leases and opened up this area for homesteading. But there was another detractor for this whole thing. And it came in the form of a report. And it was a report that was done by a fellow by the name of Captain John Palliser. And Palliser came through this area in the 1850s and the early 1860s. He called this place an arid desert with no potential for farmland. But he happened to come here during a 40-year drought. So he came here when he saw this land at its worst, at its driest, and it had been for quite a few years before he got here. Now there were other travelers who came here And they kept saying, but there's enough rain here. The soil's good. We've got moisture. But nobody listened because they went back to the Palliser report time and time and time again. So that made it hard to encourage people to come into this area. Except there was coal found here. And Elliot Galt, who was the son of one of our fathers of Confederation, Sir Alexander Galt, was out here as Edward Dewdney's assistant, so the assistant to the Indian Commissioner. And when he was traveling in this area, he was noticing very substantial coal seams. And he took some samples and sent them back to his father, and his father was immediately interested and started to get investors, mostly from England, mostly from London. They were keen to get into a part of this new area of North America as an investment. So he got money for that. His son started to hire people from Europe predominantly, from the eastern United States and from the eastern Canadian area. And he brought in miners. And in the valley, the river valley that flows right through Lethbridge, they started to mine coal. So coal is great. It was a real good steamer coal, which was perfect for industry and for steam trains. But wait a minute, their main customer, the CPR, goes through Medicine Hat. Oh, well, that didn't matter. They just got more investors and they started a railway. So they built a railway, a narrow gauge railway called the Turkey Trail, from Lethbridge to Dunmore, which is near Medicine Hat. And because the CPR was their only customer and could handle all of their finances, set the rate for coal, they also sent a train railway down to Great Falls to the Anaconda gold or copper mine, where they needed his coal as well. So the first people that came into this area, other than the Mounties and a few very, very brave souls, were coal miners. But most of those coal miners wanted to earn enough money to buy land or to get a homestead and work the land. So I got to look at the name because the Galt family changed the names of their company almost every few years. The first one was the Western Coal and Navigation Company. The first navigation that they tried to get their coal to the market in Medicine Hat was steam paddle wheelers. Now, how many of you know the river that flows through here? How often do you think you could get a steamboat up or down that river?
1 month a year.
Exactly. June, when it's flooding. They learned that very quickly, and that's when they put in the railway. Okay. So, like the CPR, when the government had encouraged the CPR to put the railway across Canada, they offered them large grants of land in the way of townships along their route. Well, good old MacDonald was convinced by Alexander Galt, who was a compatriot and a colleague, to allow the people in the land grant in this area to be one solid block of land. They anticipated to sell it to ranchers, because still had that belief that it was a country that grass was only good for ranching. So this really worked out in their favor in the long run, but they couldn't sell it for ranch land. There was still lots of land available without buying land, plus it didn't make them much money. Selling land for ranching was not anywhere near as good an economic situation as selling land for farming. But we're going to go back to Palliser. There's still this myth. This area is no good for farming. But Elliot Galt knew better. He knew that he had to get some support through officials in the government to encourage them to support irrigation systems in this area. The government wasn't interested, but there was a very influential man by the name of William Pierce And Pierce was very much an advocate for keeping water in the public domain. He'd seen what had happened in the States, where the first people that went in there made their wealth, managed the water, and could control it. He didn't want that to happen here. He wanted the access to water to be available for the whole community. So they actually enacted an Irrigation Act in, I've lost my date. It was the date's not important. But this allowed the irrigation to become a more realistic potential. And the Galts had that large block of land which stretched from here west and south along the rivers, which were the good irrigation rivers, including the St. Mary. But they were missing two things. The Galt companies were missing two things: expertise and labor. Does anybody know where the Galts went to sign a formal agreement that would provide both of those? Utah, exactly. The Galts actually signed a formal contract with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I wanted to make sure I said that right. It was the church that they signed this contract with. And I think that that says something for the Galt family, because a lot of people had a lot of suspicions about the Mormons and they didn't want them coming here. But the Galts knew that if they brought these experts in, they would bring laborers with them. And the laborers were offered a half pay their pay was half in dollars and half in land. So it was giving a whole new generation of people from the States a start here with land and jobs. And it gave us the first irrigation system in this part of the country. But it's never quite as simple as saying, okay, let's go dig ditches. Charles McGrath was a surveyor, and he was able to do all the surveying for the irrigation. But the Americans wanted the same water. So the two of the major rivers that were feeding water into this area, the St. Mary and the Milk River, both originate in the United States. Well, Montana is as dry as we are. They wanted that water for their own irrigation systems. So what they did is they started a ditch to divert the water from the Milk River into the Marias River, which meant it wouldn't come into Canada at all. So you know what we Canadians did? We dug what was called the Spike Ditch and started to divert the water from the St. Mary's all the way they started a ditch that would transfer all that money and keep it in Canada. So this is when water issues were really becoming important here. And Sir Elliot Galt had attended a couple of congresses in the United States, one in Colorado and one in New Mexico. And he was the one who actually introduced a motion that Canada, the United States, and Mexico needed to develop an international joint commission that would sit down and discuss any of the concerns around sharing water. And that was for lake water, where boundaries went through the middle. It was also for flowing water, where the water crossed the border. And it went through in 1909. It's called the International Boundary Water Treaty of 1909. And that stands today. That treaty is in place, and it is what we go to whenever there's any sort of confrontation or discussion around water between the two countries. Really? It has been or it has not been? Yeah. It may not be able to because of this treaty. I don't know, I'm guessing, but.
They haven't updated. They're waiting for it to fail.
Oh, okay.
Toured it last summer.
Yeah. If you go down through Milk River and you look carefully, you'll be able to see the remnants of the spite ditch that's still evident if you really look carefully along the roadside. So the St. Mary Irrigation Project went ahead in the late 1890s, and by 1900 it had started to feed this area, including Lethbridge. Lethbridge had an irrigation dish that came right into the city. One other thing that I want to mention about irrigation before I go on is that there was a fellow here by the name of Peter Langman. Does anybody recognize the name Langman? No? Well, if you drive through this irrigation area, you'll see what is called the Langman Gate. And so one of our own locals designed and built that gate for the St. Mary district. And it now is being used across Canada, the United States, and overseas as well. So one other thing that the Galt family did, among many things, like they donated land for 4 of the first churches in Lethbridge. They donated the land for Galt Gardens. They built the first hospital and then offered more money for the addition that was built in 1910, then donated that all to the city. But this other thing is when they were bringing and selling their land, like the land that they owned was not homestead land. You had to buy it. But they found that people needed to learn how to farm in this area and how to use irrigation. So they started a model farm. They brought in William Fairfield, who was the first superintendent. And this is what developed into our Lethbridge Research. What's the right name for it now?
Lethbridge Research and Development Center.
And Development Center, yeah. So this was the precursor to that. And we were talking about the soil that was here. You mentioned that a little earlier, Ron. William Fairfield couldn't figure out why alfalfa wouldn't grow here. He could see it growing in profusion in Wyoming, but he did some research and he discovered that there was a bacterium in Wyoming that didn't exist in the soil here. So he brought some of that soil to this area, started a small plot. The alfalfa did really well, and from there he was able to inoculate other land. And what it is a, I'll just say it right here, Rhizobium bacterium, and that's what this soil was not producing. So over the last 100 years, we saw how the farm was changing. Ron and Richard were talking about some of the changes that they've experienced. And of course, we've gone from the horse to GPS tractors. The initial crops that grew here were wheat, and that was probably the main market crop. Barley and oats, if they were grown, were usually grown for animal feed on the farm. And so there weren't many other crops. And now there's hundreds of different types of crops that are being grown. So anyway, that's a little bit of the history of how farming started in this area. So, thank you.